am. I've got my official logo at the top there. Simon says I'm the Advocacy and Movements Lead with the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I'm just going to introduce and host the workshop today. Please use mute if you're not speaking, so that we can so we don't have interferences. But yeah, whilst we're still waiting for folks to come in and join, please let us know where you're calling in from in the chat, and we'll start using the chat a little bit to register questions during the workshop as well. Let us know where you're calling in from, how you're feeling, where you work, so that we get an idea of the scope of the audience. And I'm just going to give. I think we'll kick off, Kate, right? I think we'll get started because we've got only an hour and we've got a lot to fit in an hour. So big welcome. Just quickly explain these sessions. These how to talk about a well-being economy sessions have been hosted and developed by Kate Petru, who will be giving us starting off with a framing on how to talk about our well-being economy. And these have been, we've had 3 or 4 sessions, but now again we're exploring looking at how to talk about our well-being economy from a more of a thematic perspective. Now, from the perspective of environmentalists. And this is the first time we've done this, and we want to explore this from a more environmental perspective. And environmental is deliberate because we want to go beyond the kind of important but narrow focus of climate and what some people call climate tunnel vision. And so it's climate and biodiversity, land degradation and pollution and oceans, all of the ecosystems upon which we depend, and our economies also depend on. So we're really happy to be able to have this session and this workshop and do it together with Greenpeace. And I'll actually let Kate and Gavin present themselves when they pick up the microphone. But we have Gavin Thompson, who's with the Wellbeing Economy Project, the Greenpeace, and you know, Kate is going to give us a framing of this session from the perspective of WEAll, and Gavin is going to complement that with, so how has Greenpeace been implementing this narrative? How has Greenpeace been addressing the dominant economic paradigm in its narrative, but also in the implementation of its Wellbeing Economy project, and from a kind of a specialist, very well respected environmental campaigning organization. And we've had a strategic collaboration with Greenpeace for some time now, which is great to have. So welcome also, Gavin, for this talk. I think that would be all for an introduction, Kate, and I think that's best to hand over to you straight away. You can get into the presentation.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. Can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, beauty. Thanks so much for joining How to Talk About a Wellbeing Economy for Environmentalists. My name is Kate Petru, she, her. I'm based in Crystal Beach, Ontario, which is the original territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. I'm just going to dive right in. First, I just want to quickly talk about the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. If you're not aware of us or have heard of us yet, we started back in 2017 as a collaboration between academics, NGOs, and activists who recognized that the dominant economic model being followed across the world wasn't delivering for the majority of people, and it was leading to runaway climate change and driving inequality. Since then, we've grown quite a bit. We have 17 hubs across the world. We have 3,000 members. And then we also have 6 regional and national governments. So we help to spearhead the Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership Program. This is a collaborative effort by a group of governments committed to shifting the focus of their economies from traditional measures like GDP to broader measures of well-being, looking at health, the environment, social equity, etc. And actually, it was spearheaded by a number of female prime ministers, which I think is quite cool. So Jacinda Ardern, Nicola Sturgeon, and Katrin Jakobsdottir, Iceland. We have a 3-pronged theory of approach in terms of our theory of change. So we look at trying to change the cultural narratives, looking at policy, rules, and practices at the institutional level, and then also amplifying organizations around the world who are already implementing these solutions. And today we're going to be digging deep into the narrative portion of that. And just to give you a heads up, we have been helping to hopefully shift the narrative in the social media landscape and also in the mainstream media. We've had some great hits in The Guardian, The Economist, CNN Espanol, and the BBC, etc. So now I'm just going to get into, what is the economy? Well, the economy really is the way that we produce and provide for one another. Sometimes some people try to make it, especially the financial industry, a little more complex, but really it's just the way that we produce and provide for one another. And at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we believe that people and planet are not here to serve the economy, but instead the economy is here to serve us. So, for example, we shouldn't be needing to justify why investing in healthcare benefits the economy. Instead, we should be evaluating the economy on its contribution to health and well-being. But the problem is we've elevated the way we see the economy for so long that it's so hard for us to move beyond this economic logic because of the dominant narrative. And I love this quote. This is from one of our partners, Roman, but he says, most people don't realize that capitalism was a choice. It was something that we created. We'll get into that in a second, and an invention. But we don't realize when we're born into that invention. It's sort of like a fish in water. Is there anything really beyond the water? But what I love to see are more and more environmentalists are beginning to see the flaws in our current economic system, and they're connecting the dots. So they realize that climate change isn't just an environmental problem, it's a system of a deeper issue. And so that's why we see, messages like systems change, not climate change. But the problem is our current economy treats nature as an input to be exploited and success as GDP growth at all costs. So we have things like fossil fuels driving emissions, global emissions, industrial food production driving deforestation, or mining for minerals impacting the quality of our water and aquatic ecosystems, or planned obsolescence creating more waste. What's wild is that all of these things are really rewarded by our financial system, and they help to increase GDP. So often we see graphs like this with GDP going up, up, and up. But what we don't see is the environmental cost included in that. And that's because environmental destruction isn't included into the balance sheet. And this is just nature, but not to mention the impact that our economic system has on our health, on inequality, etc. And if we did include these externalities into GDP, maybe real growth would look something like this under a magnifying glass. So a team of MIT scientists actually mapped out the impact of unchecked GDP growth on nature, population, etc., all the way back in 1972. Maybe some of you have heard of this book before, called The Limits to Growth. It was done by the Club of Rome, and they used one of the first major computer models to show the cost of using the planet's finite resources for growth, and found it would lead, actually, if we continued like this, it would lead to potential collapse in the 21st century if nothing changed. So here you can see some of these graphs, and actually the University of Melbourne tracked the book's predictions over the past 40 years. And what they noticed is that their predictions were unfortunately eerily correct. So we see things here like the environmental resources depleting, population increasing. But then when we look at this, the second one here, we can see the health impacts of that, right? The death rate, birth rate, all sort of hitting these peak points. And this is because we know there's a direct correlation between planetary exploitation and health. The president of Iceland, actually, who is part of the WEAll, Wellbeing Economy Government Partnership Program, said, it's impossible to have healthy people on a sick planet. And I love this graph here, and or image, and it just really shows us that all of these things are interconnected: pollution, climate change, to, nutritional diseases, non-communicable diseases, etc., and mental health. So the economic system, which centers profit and not well-being, really isn't doing us any favors. And it's not making us any happier. Living in a world of constant competition has led us to increasing anxiety, loneliness, and despair. And now depression is one of the leading causes of disability worldwide. So extreme inequality as well has grown, and we can see this around us, with 8 billionaires owning more wealth than 50% of the world's population. We can just tell things aren't making sense right now. It doesn't feel right. So climate, inequality, loneliness, our health crisis is all connected to an economic system that is not serving us. And so this is where the idea of a well-being economy comes into play. And I'll get a little bit more into this, but at the center of this, we've created a framework called WEAll 5 Needs. And these are some of the 5 principles we believe that a well-being economy should have. So one of them is dignity. Everyone should have enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness. Fairness. There should be justice interventions at the heart of our economic system. Participation. Citizens need to be actively engaged in their communities and economic decisions. Nature is a key part of this. Humans are one with nature and give back as much as we take. And also purpose. We all have a shared sense of institution, belonging, and our institutions serve the common good. But many of these principles, they're not new. They are new with a K, because they come from indigenous thinking like Buen Vivir or Kukaitia Kitanga from Maori cultures. They really all embodied the wisdom of living in balance in nature. So well-being economy, what does that look like? Well, it's one where we recognize nature as a living system and that we are all part of. We're going beyond GDP. People have meaningful work. We're supporting equity and justice with, restoration involves land rights, indigenous stewardship, healing relationships with ecosystems and each other. And a key part of this is also long-term legacy, intergenerational justice instead of short-term profits that mortgage our future. But how did we get to this economic system where we're exploiting everything and things seem to be cracking at the seams? Well, many historians will tell you that actually capitalism, started back in the 1700s, but it was born out of other systems. So even if you didn't take history, maybe you've heard of some of these before, but feudalism and mercantilism. And they were defined by extreme exploitation. So feudalism in the 9th to 15th century, wealth was tied to landlords, peasants worked it, often with little freedom or reward. Mercantilism in the 15th to 18th century, wealth came from controlling trade, empires, and extracting resources, often through colonial conquest. But neither of these systems prioritized well-being or freedom, and they concentrated power at the top. So capitalism happened to inherit many of these traits. Now, we no longer have wealth solely in the hands of monarchs, but as the previous slide showed, there is a huge concentration of wealth at the top, and exploitation is still a feature of this system. So if we look back, even up until the mid-19th centuries, England lost around 90% of its ancient woodland. But I think what's really interesting when we think about things from a historical perspective, going back to the 9th or 15th centuries, there were other flavors of economies. There were other ways of providing goods and services for one another. We had in the Middle East the Silk Road, wealth was built through commerce and culture and knowledge sharing, but not through constant extraction or overconsumption. We had the Inca in South America, where it was built with sophisticated systems of redistribution. But they didn't have money in the same way that we think about it, but there were really systems of reciprocity where food and resources were shared across the empire to prevent poverty. And then there were also indigenous economies across Turtle Island or in Aotearoa. They were based on balance. People only took what they needed, and they cared for land and water as living beings and built wealth through relationships and collective well-being. But here we are today in capitalism, and our current economic system didn't win because it was better for people. It won because it was spread through colonization, conquest, and often violence. And some might say, well, GDP is good for people, right? It doesn't help us to, increase life expectancy. This is true, but up to a certain point. So there's something called diminishing marginal returns. And if you didn't take economics class, it basically means you get less bang for your buck the more you have of something. So think of it akin to salt. Salt is really good when you add it into your meals, but too much of salt, it's really not good for your health. And the same thing applies for GDP. So I love this graph here, and it really explains this. So you see life expectancy does increase as GDP increases, but it hits a point of diminishing marginal returns and that levels off. So you can see in Lebanon, they might have a GDP per capita of, 7,800, but they actually have a longer life expectancy than the United States with a GDP per capita of 60,000. So we don't need this constant growth. And actually, this is a graph I came across recently, but who's benefiting from this economic growth? This graph here shows us the richest 1% captured 54% of global growth. And then the richest 5% captured 70% of global growth. So the type of growth matters, and who's getting that growth matters. And that's why we need to look into it. And even the founder of GDP himself, Simon Kuznets, back in 1930, said, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income as defined by the GDP. He warned Congress not to take it too seriously, but here we are. So now I'm going to get into narratives and trying to understand, well, what can we do with this information and how can we help to shift towards a well-being economy? So what are narratives? They're basically stories and frameworks used to communicate and promote transformative changes in societal systems and norms. So it's not really a flash in the pan. It's not a quick communication campaign. It's really about changing beliefs, attitudes, and perceptions, in the long term. So how currently are people perceiving the economy? Well, what we find is that many people are intimidated to actually discuss the economy. Research found that only a third of British people feel comfortable engaging with economics, and only 17% think they have a good understanding of the economy and cannot accurately define what GDP is. Many said it was akin to sort of a black, mysterious box. They don't really feel like they have control over it. And how does this apply to, environmentalists? Well, I think many, I am an environmentalist myself, but I think many can feel it's too complex. Maybe it's outside their expertise, or it's too political, or basically the dominant growth narrative really takes over everything, and it just feels too intimidating. So what is the dominant narrative? GDP growth equals success, trickle-down economics, etc. And we see this in the media. They're still obsessed with GDP over things like unemployment, life expectancy, etc. But we really want to change that. We want to move towards, a well-being economy. Success is measured by the quality of life, not just GDP growth. Everyone has access to resources they need. Citizens are actively engaged. And there's some really great research that has come out that people are really open to a new economic system. 28 of 34 countries found that they're open to anti-capitalist ideas. Many believe we should be taxing the wealthy, having higher carbon taxes, etc. So I think people are quite ready. So how do we do this? And this is a framework that we use in our own narratives and communication. We hope you can too. So we want to start by activating a shared value, explain the problem and solution, and then end with a call to action. And why do we start with a shared value? Well, we want to establish common ground. So maybe someone who's maybe on the complete far right may likely more agree with you if you start with something they believe in as well. So we might say something like, most of us, or we all believe, or no matter where we look like or where we come from, we want families to have the freedom to drink clean water, breathe safe air, live in healthy communities. Another key in your communication when talking about the economy is emphasize that we do have control. People feel more optimistic and motivated to take action if they feel like they know that we can have collective power over our economy. So now I'm going to get into some examples of that, starting with two of the five needs. I'll apply some of those frameworks to those values, and hopefully that will make more sense. So, one value here we talked about is nature. Humans, I think we can all agree this, anyone on the political left or right, humans should be one with nature and we should give back as much as we take from Earth. And diving into the problem, the climate crisis, we're at record highs in human history. Economic growth is tied to rising GDP. Global wildlife population has plummeted by almost 70% since 1970. And then connecting it to the economy and GDP. But cleaning up an oil spill might actually be good for the economy, which is wild. So we're organizing our economy around GDP growth, making policy decisions like this. We end up really setting up the wrong priorities. I think also in our work, we try to quote people that are of influence. I think that gives it credibility. But even Bobby Kennedy once said, gross national product counts air pollution, cigarette advertising, ambulances to clear our carnage. It neither measures our wit, nor our courage, nor our wisdom, or our learning. Anyway, it measures everything in short except that which makes life worth living. And then we dive into the solution. So there are people that are going beyond GDP. So we can look at Costa Rica and a town called Costa Rica itself as a country, but also Curitiba. They have a beautiful project called the Sweet City. And this is where the mayor prioritized the environment and well-being over economic growth. And there's high levels of well-being with relatively low GDP. So they have 0.03% of the GDP of the US, but have a longer life expectancy. And actually, they're nearing 100% renewable energy. Another great example of this in action is the Wales Future Generation Act of 2015. This actually came out of a participatory process with the citizens of Wales, and the aim is to improve social, economic, and environmental and cultural well-being. And so the act encourages the public bodies in Wales to think about future generations, think about the long-term impacts of their decisions anytime that comes up. So, for example, they have a Future Generations Commissioner and a highway project was proposed, but it was scrapped because it didn't align with the values and the principles of the legislation. They found that the highway project went through wetlands, and it was misaligned with the interest and favored short-term profits instead. So they scrapped it. And actually, what happened is that snowballed and they ended up investing more in public transportation, which was awesome. So in summary, we all want to be applying the framework all in one here, but in summary, value, we want to be able to enjoy a safe and thriving natural world. But our natural world is cracking at the seams, global wildlife population has plummeted, and we're running out of time to stop climate change. The economic model we inherited didn't factor in the natural limits of the Earth. But then we get into the positive. Again, we want to give them hope and show that we can change this. We can redesign our economy to prioritize the well-being of people and planet over profit. WEAll's Future Generations Act offers a promising example, and all policies can be assessed for their impact on future generations, which includes the environment. And then we follow up with a call to action. Follow us here if you're interested to learn more. So now I'll get into one last value here. So I chose dignity. I think everyone can believe that everyone should have enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness. But the problem is economic growth is impacting millions globally. Environmental justice means the cost of pollution and climate change fall hardest on marginalized communities with least political power, while the benefits of economic growth are enjoyed elsewhere. Which is not fair. So we have places like Chemical Valley in Sarnia, where there's high rates of cancer and reproductive issues, or the Lithium Triangle in South America, or the oil spills in Nigeria, causing a loss of access to fresh water or farming, or wet bulb temperature in India. which causes extreme humidity, and it's really dangerous to even be working outside, which causes a loss of income. And as we talked about before, again, making these connections in your arguments between the economy, health, etc., and the environment. But the World Health Organization estimates approximately 24% of the global burden of disease is now attributed to environmental risk factors. And then ending off with the solution. So this is a beautiful example of bringing in marginalized communities to create well-being economy frameworks that go beyond GDP. So Aotearoa in New Zealand, they created the Living Standards Framework, and that was actually developed alongside Maori stakeholders, which obviously connecting with their values, recognizing the interconnectedness of people, the environment, spiritual well-being. And so there's been some great insights that have come out of this as well. So despite living in a system that really sometimes does conflict with the Indigenous worldviews, Maori businesses are thriving, and they show that leading with a values-led economy can really help and have a place where both people and nature flourish. And then lastly, you've probably heard of this before, but citizens' assemblies are a great way to really counter this. So in France, they had a citizens' assembly where they picked 150 different citizens, and they presented 149 proposals that were actually integrated into France's climate and resilience law. Although some of them were diluted, it was actually really quite progressive. And our favorite citizens' assembly is Ostbelgien in Eastern Belgium, where they have a permanent citizens' assembly. And as citizens are invited at random to take part in a panel for 3 months at a time and deliberate on a topic. So in summary, bringing it all together again, everyone deserves to live in dignity and in a safe and healthy environment, no matter their race, income, or zip code. Yet polluting industries are far more likely to place near communities of color. This environmental racism means toxic air, contaminated water, higher rates of asthma, health problems, as we were talking about. But bringing in the solution, we can redesign our economy to focus on what truly matters. In New Zealand, Maori leaders were invited to help create a new framework that helps to inform policies. And in France, citizens' assemblies brought people together to help shape policies on climate action as well. So call to action, we need these kinds of inclusive participatory processes to help dismantle environmental racism and create fairer and healthier communities for everyone. So that is it. Thank you so much, everyone. And I will hand it over to Gavin. And if we have questions on this, we will answer them at the end or just pop it into the chat.
Oh, hi everyone. Thanks so much, Kate. That was awesome. Just share some emojis. And I'll share my screen as well, but I'll speed through it so we have time for questions and discussion, because I think there was a lot in Kate's presentation that's really interesting to discuss. So everyone can see that okay? Looks good. Greenpeace Wellbeing Economy. Thanks so much. So just to introduce myself to start, my name's Gavin. I work at Greenpeace on the Wellbeing Economy and a few other projects. I'm based in London in the UK. I'm originally from Glasgow in Scotland. And the work that I'm going to be talking about, just to be clear, I didn't do any of it. I shouldn't get any credit. I want to be clear, it's my colleagues mainly in Korea, Indonesia, and Middle East, North Africa, parts of Greenpeace that should get any credit for any of the good stuff here. Greenpeace started working on the wellbeing economy, developed this project a few years ago when we realized that across the network of Greenpeace, many campaigns were starting to focus more on socioeconomic issues. And of course, those related to the climate and biodiversity issues that many people, many audiences would associate with Greenpeace. But it was a recognition that we first needed to make progress on changing the narratives around our economic systems and changing that system as a prerequisite, as a necessary step for a lot of the changes for climate and biodiversity that we want to see. So these are the key premises underpinning our Wellbeing Economy campaign work. There's enough money in the world to ensure well-being for all. Our role as Greenpeace is advocating for the solutions on which the money should be spent. Let me explain a little bit more what I mean. These are the three aspects that we've worked on so far. So beyond GDP, that Kate's already talked about, GDP isn't sufficient as a metric to look at the health of an individual or an economy or a country. That's a lot of our work as well. Tax justice work. So asking for more progressive taxation systems, but in particular, a wealth tax, a global wealth tax. So then the question becomes, if there is more progressive taxation and there is an increased tax revenue in individual countries, individual governments, or globally, what are we advocating that revenue is spent on? What are the solutions, the well-being solutions? So that's a big part of our work. Okay, here we're just looking at lots of highlights. I should say at this stage, Kate will circulate this slide deck and the slides she just presented along with the recording for this session. So in the notes under this slide, you can find lots of links to all of this work. A few things to highlight: that the beautiful snow is an action in Davos for the World Economic Forum. We created a beautiful artistic design in the snow. Let's move forward. So these are some of the big hits from social media last year. So in the bottom left, this is a cartoon by Greenpeace Korea looking at the insufficiency, why GDP doesn't do what we need it to, why it's not a good way of measuring a country's health. I think that's an interesting example. It did really well online. It's really friendly, approachable, and trying to break down very complex ideas into simple language. This video on the bottom right is a song that Greenpeace produced in collaboration with some musicians, and the song is about trying to decommodify our lives, basically trying to not let this hyper-capitalist logic intrude on every area of public life, and that performed really well. And what I want to say, these are the key questions that we're constantly talking about internally, but that we're trying to answer as a campaign, trying to transform narratives, stay adaptive and relevant. So this is one of the key points I want to get across is, in any part of Greenpeace, anywhere we're working, but in particular, like I said, Korea, Indonesia, Middle East, North Africa, these are places, like everywhere, that have constantly shifting political contexts and economic environment. And our work needs to relate to that. So it can be quite easy to talk in the abstract about a failed global economic system which isn't serving people and planet. And that is true. But I think we have found individuals, audiences, communities won't engage, won't mobilize unless it speaks to their context and their needs, what's happening in their area, their country. And so there is a balance there, I think, for us when we're trying to think about our campaigning and our communications, is how we bring these two elements together. These are the four elements of our wellbeing economy. And what I would highlight is a lot of it is geared towards finding local solutions. So understanding there are solutions that are already in place that are helping to improve the lives of communities and protect them from extreme weather events, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. But those solutions already exist, and our role as Greenpeace often is to amplify them, to advocate for their wider rollout, maybe at municipal level, national level, perhaps at a regional level. But as understanding it's a bottom-up process, that the solutions are out there in the communities that we want to work with are already implementing those solutions. So how do we tell the story? The dominant narrative stuff, I think Kate already spoke about. There's a lot of ways that we talk about the economy that not only aren't helpful, they're not true. And that's what we're battling against. And we need to be clear about that. And I included this as well, just to take that one step further, as we think quite a lot about the frames that are present, either in the things that we are doing and writing and saying, but also in public life and mainstream media more generally. So this is some thinking we've recently done around the framings that we're using. So it's not you, it's the system. Looking at frame one in the top left. That's a really important frame, right? Because we all know individuals aren't responsible. Anything that puts the responsibility on the individual is usually trying to mislead you and is just not helpful. And so that's really important, that anything we put out is not putting responsibility on the individual and making more of a systemic point. But then trying to think one step beyond that, there is a role for the individual, and it's to get involved in their communities and try to change that system. So that's just an example of trying to make sure that we're remaining active, as well as bringing things like analysis and a critique, or a criticism of maybe a complex economic system, that it remains active. There's optimism, there's enthusiasm, there's hope that when you get involved with your community, things can change. That's really important when we're thinking about communication. Yeah. Okay, let me skip on. Okay, so these are some different ways that we tell the story. This is a recent episode of the Greenpeace System Shift podcast. The title of it sort of sums up a part of the well-being economy. How can I think of the planet when I can't even afford the rent? I think that goes back to this point I was saying about trying to make messages relevant for people's context. Of course, everything we do within Greenpeace relates to climate and biodiversity, but we have to understand many people won't immediately engage with that argument if they have more pressing material concerns, and that communication we put out or ways we're trying to mobilize people needs to acknowledge that. Sometimes that's the primary message, that's the opening sentence, that's the way we go in. It's unlikely Greenpeace would be working on it if it didn't somehow also relate to the climate, but that doesn't always need to be the way you begin the conversation. Anyway, this podcast I would recommend. Again, the link will be in the slides. Greenpeace Middle East North Africa recently held a Wellbeing Economy Awards ceremony, which was really successful. It was an opportunity to expand the network, so they gave awards to academics who are working on interesting ideas, like influencers, broadcasters. So the awards itself garnered some media coverage, but also it helps you build out the network and find people and expand the community that you're talking about a well-being economy with. This is a recent report from Greenpeace Middle East North Africa as well on extractivism primarily in Morocco and Egypt. And some recent a training camp and a conference on eco-farming. This is an example of what I was talking about, local solutions. So this work didn't only look at farming practices, but also ownership structures like cooperatives. So it's finding solutions, working out how can Greenpeace help to amplify those, spread the message, and work maybe with bodies of government to make sure they are introduced more widely, more sustainable farming practices. This is work from Greenpeace Indonesia. The photo is from the May Day, Labor Day. And Greenpeace Indonesia is working with the communities around Jakarta on solutions to these kinds of environmental issues, air pollution, land conflict, and trying to find out what solutions are working well and how can we spread those. And so this is a really successful a climate resilience picnic in Indonesia, where they used the opportunity. They brought a lot of people together and used the opportunity to talk about practical skills such as composting. But also, anyway, but a lot of this work, this engaging with, for example, farmers or farming practices or communities around Jakarta, is talking about extreme weather events and climate adaptation, understanding these are lived experiences of people and communities that need to respond to a very changing, very dangerous climate. So a lot of this work is sharing skills which are necessary, like for survival. South Korea, as many of you will know, South Korea recently went through this constitutional crisis, and the president was impeached. And it was a huge story. Of course, it dominated media coverage in Korea. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. Greenpeace Korea used that as a hook to then talk about why we need to pay attention, not just to the presidency, but the economy, and what kind of economy do we want to see. And some of the media work that they did around that was hugely successful. Let me just skip on. Yeah, so just to end on this is well-being economy. We often work in response mode. What I mean is in response to extreme weather events. So this is some work in Korea on heat waves with this bear who is both hot and angry. And in March, Greenpeace Indonesia did a lot of work on the flooding around Jakarta and trying to connect that flooding, the impact of it, to what caused it, which is climate change, and what could be done in future to help protect communities, like changes in land use, for example. So an example of what I'm talking about, where we need to be adaptive. We can't, I don't think, continue to say the same message all the time to all audiences. We need to think about where our audience is coming from and what is their current lived reality. And that's it. I'll end it there. You can contact me, and those are the Instagram accounts for the 3 parts of Greenpeace I mentioned. Thank you so much.
Wow, wonderful. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Gavin. Really good content, really great framing, and I think very clear understanding of the connections between our economic systems and the wider ecosystem of planet Earth that we all depend on and live in. I think I've been following the chat. We got a really good group of folks. We had more than 80 people at the start, mainly from Africa, Europe, and the US. And we'll be having another session later this evening for me in Mexico, for Asia and Australia, New Zealand later today. And I've been following the chat, Kate and Gavin. There's a few questions have come up, but please use this as an opportunity to put any questions in the chat that you want, or put your hand up with the little button so we can see you, and we can take some questions from the floor. A lot of interest in the chat. I think a lot following the idea of beyond growth, the need to beyond growth. I got a lot of resonance, I think, and one quote there was, "The way we grow is against life itself," and I think there's quite a lot of consensus on the need to move beyond growth, and Kate's done a great framing of that, and why on the what and what's not working and why we need to change it. And Gavin's given us a really good insights into how we get from the what to the how. So how we address this dominant narrative. So there's a couple of questions which I'll start out with. In the meantime, please do feel free to put your hands up or put a question in the chat. So one for perhaps for both of you, which is come in the chat, is this. We often have this issue of, we feel sometimes we're preaching to the choir. How do we engage in conversations with people who don't agree with us? So there's there's been a bit of a chat in that, and something in terms of the narratives. And Kate's mentioned a little bit about that, into how to start conversations with people who don't agree we should be one with nature, don't agree with what we're proposing. So that's something that I think around the narratives. And there's a specific question for you, Gavin, in the chat, which is, how to operationalize the internal learning from this, because as as you talked about the importance of an adaptive, maintaining an adaptive, relevant um, approach, given the turbulent, uncertain, unpredictable times that we're living in, and that the importance of that. So how have you been incorporating some of the learning from that? There's a specific question there. So we'll start out with those, and then please do feel free to put any questions in the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Simon. Yeah, to that question to addressing people that might not agree with you. That's why we have tested this narrative framework of starting with the value, getting into the problem, and then getting into the solution and kind of the call to action, and we found that that works. But I hear you in the comment there was some people don't believe we are one with nature, and Donald Trump probably doesn't agree with that too. I think some of it has to do with language. But if you asked Donald Trump, I don't want to actually say it, if we asked someone who was like far right, for example, to say, do you want your kids to have clean air and clean drinking water, he would probably say yes. So I think sometimes like it's a bit of a language thing, but you might want to ask, instead of maybe starting off with your opinion, maybe ask them questions like that you think might be important to them, and then try to find, where those values overlap. But at the same time, depending on what organization or company you might be from, you really want to target audiences that are probably a little more lukewarm, right? And continue to engage them. And that's why we wanted to hold this session here today too. I think a lot of environmentalists know there's something wrong about the economy, but they're maybe not quite ready to like connect those dots yet. So yeah, trying to bring in the value piece and keep chipping away at this dominant economic narrative of our current economic model. I think that can help. One last thing is also, I think the tone of it really helps. Really not not trying to make them feel like you're coming from a higher ground or place of authority, to say, I think we can all agree on this, right? And I think then that person might be more open to engaging with you and hearing some of those solutions. So maybe hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Kate. Do you want to take that question, Gavin, as well? There's actually a follow-up question, could be for both as well, but thinking how to engage from a country level with this. So there's an opportunity there to join up with WEAll at a local level, or with Greenpeace at a local level as well. So do you want to answer the question on the how to operationalize the internal learning?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to Boone in the chat for asking that question. I think Boone from Friends of the Earth Europe, a really great question. How to operationalize internal learning, because some of the concepts that we're working on are pretty complicated, and I think it's important for everyone involved to understand them in order to then explain them in very simple terms, both to our colleagues in the wider organization, but also in our communications. There's a few practical things we do, like we have equivalent of lunch and learn sessions where we maybe invite an external speaker or an expert from some part of Greenpeace who can talk about like donut economics or degrowth or some of these concepts. Lunch and learn is misleading, of course, because it's a global workforce and it'll be very early for some people and very late at night. No one's eating lunch. But trying to find space to just talk about these, complicated things is very challenging when you're working on a million different campaigns. But just if I can say, and then Boone goes on to say weaving into your strategy and other campaigns, because what we have found is if we have a discussion internally about, for example, degrowth or sufficiency as an idea that has started being used a lot, is then every other campaign you work on, you start to hear very similar phrases as campaigns and terminology that's orbiting around the same idea. So those internal sessions for just being able to sit for an hour or 2 hours with an expert and improve your understanding are incredibly effective. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. And there's so the question of how to engage with this, and from like at a country level, and another question I think for perhaps Kate also, took in terms of what the best messaging in terms of working with governments. And certainly, so Kate presented at the beginning the framing that we have um, with several governments that have adopted wellbeing economy frameworks and have this intention to move forward in terms of going beyond growth and looking at so the examples from Wales and New Zealand and other wellbeing economy governments. That certainly helps when engaging with governments to have that to be able to reference that this experience is out there. It's something viable. It's actually being implemented in by different governments across the world. So anything else on that, Kate, in terms of the right messaging, in terms of engaging with governments, perhaps the policy making course as well that we have out there.
Yeah,
And
no,
yeah,
exactly. And I think it really our obviously our communications changed based on different audiences that we're working with. So if we're working with people, in movements or social justice, we might use language that they're more familiar with versus policymakers, for example. But we do have a policy design course that we launched at the beginning of the year. It took us around, I think, almost 2 years to develop. And so now we have a knowledge department that's working with different policymakers. We just spoke with some folks in the Norwegian government, and then I know we're talking with some folks in Portugal as well, and doing workshops with these different policymakers on the course and helping them to understand how they can kind of create a well-being economy vision and how they can get internal buy-in and things like that. So a lot of that information is actually within this course. So hopefully that can help. And if you are a policymaker or know others that might be interested in this, let us know, because we do online workshops directly with them. But yeah, hopefully that helps. Oh, Lowry.
Lowry, yeah, go for it.
Hi, I have a question. So when I've been having some of these conversations, an obvious like elephant in the room or something that keeps coming up is like advances in AI.
Mhm.
And obviously a lot of people talking about increases in GDP, but that coming alongside huge increases in inequality. You talked earlier about the 1%, job losses, meaning, questions around, yeah, like meaning crisis, productivity gains, but also like implications on environment. And I was just wondering like whether that comes up a lot for you when you have these conversations, and like how you might deal with that from a well-being economy perspective and also potentially Greenpeace.
Mhm. That's a great question. I'm happy to dive in unless Gavin, you wanted to start.
No, you go.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, it's something that we're working on and building out. But yeah, we're always connecting it back to the framework that we have. So the We All Five Needs. We also have something called the Four Ps, which I'll send along. But anyway, we have we're actually working on something right now with an influencer and talking about we're connecting it with one of the areas, which is, let's just choose for this one, it's inequality. And so for this project, we're looking at, okay, in the past, we've had these big historical tech booms in the 1980s and also in the early 2000s with the dot-com bubble. But a lot of the gains from productivity went to some of the corporate elites or managers and wealthier folks. So this time we're saying, anchoring that in our framework is pre-distribution. So instead of redistributing the wealth that comes from the productivity of AI, we're saying from the onset, we need to make sure that we're pre-distributing the gains from productivity that are coming from AI. So that's just one element that we're looking at, but obviously we're encouraging that it's done in a sustainable way. And right now we're talking with some Indigenous leaders as well who are building out AIs that are yeah, aiming to be more sustainable and bringing in more Indigenous values and things like that. But And a short answer to that is we're working on that whole framework. And so when we have that come out, we'll keep you posted. Sign up for our newsletter, but keep a watch on our social media because we are going to be launching more about that. And as it's all happening so quickly, we're still fleshing out our stance and connections and helping people understand the connections to a well-being economy to prevent the worst from happening. Yeah.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, I think on the AI question, that's really exploding as we speak, and I think we're almost behind on the learning curve on this. It's clearly there's like two big issues. I think one is the impact that it will clearly have and is having on different sectors of the economy in terms of how we produce things, and that is one side of the coin, if you like, and then the other is how do we use it to further our causes, right? Because right now, I think that it's a source of even greater inequality between those who have access to digital communications, between those who have access to AI, and those that don't across the world. So there's two things that we need to be looking at. And just one, I'm now wary of time, Kate and Gavin. There's an opportunity I think I'd like to mention in terms of, because people have been asking how to engage. And I think so we're going to share the recording of this. There's quite a lot of resources that are being shared and information being shared in the chat, so we can follow up with that. But there isn't, with everything that's going on in the world, in terms of environmental decline and climate change, in terms of rising authoritarianism, in terms of the war and the genocide that we're witnessing, it feels that it really is a time to unify. And there have been some global mobilizations happening that bring all of these different themes together. And there is one happening which we can share information around. It's called Draw the Line. You're bringing together climate, environmental, social justice, and new economy movements, trying to come together to draw the line and stop further harm from being done, but also point to the sorts of changes that we've been talking about here in terms of the need to change and shift systems towards the delivery of well-being of people and the planet. So that's something to look out for. And Torbele, thank you for that. I was looking for that. I should have that on. I should have that by memory by now. But Torbele has put a link in the chat, and there are different ways of connecting with that. We don't have this in Portuguese or Spanish yet, but we're certainly working on Spanish translations of a lot of our presentations now. So I think that September mobilization is really important. And, remember that this is an ongoing battle. So COP30 in Brazil is going to be a key moment. Just this week, well, at the end of last week, Lula vetoed what's being called the devastation bill, which would opened up the way to loggers and cattle ranchers and soy producers to just further devastate the Amazon. That's just been vetoed. So this is an ongoing conversation, and we feels that this is just a very key time to shift the momentum towards these ideas that we've been sharing on this talk. And I've got another thing to just quickly announce, that in terms of further engagement, we all host these talks once a month, and the next talk in September is going to be around the blue moral economy. And when we talk about the environment and everything, we often forget to mention oceans. And I think 2/3 of the planet are actually oceans and water. And that's such a key part in terms of addressing not only climate change, but wider biodiversity, livelihoods for millions of people. So that's going to be a next talk coming up in September. So look out for that. And of course, if you want to join WEAll, you can do so and get access to the newsletter on our website that Kate is also managing. It's WEAll.org. You can get more information there. Gavin's put out some information on his slides, where you can also join up with Greenpeace. And well, we look forward to further engaging on this. We don't have all the answers now, but I think working together is the way forward.
Yeah.
So
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Simon. And there's a great question in here on how to, how to start those conversations internally with if you're a part of an environmental organization. So that's something that we'll have a think on. And yeah, if you're joining some of our groups, we'll be sure to try to disseminate more of that information to help folks start to have those conversations. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Simon.
and the slides and the recording will share. So, please feel free to use the slides and adapt them to, to your presentations. I think it's a great compilation of what needs to happen, but also how such an important organization like Greenpeace is actually taking it forward. So great to see that combination. And thank you all for your interest and your engagement with this.
Thank
Great
you.
to see you all.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.